Hello, I'm Tootight Lautrec, and welcome to my worldwide reading tour, where I'm going to be reading another selection from the book Great Escapes from Detroit by my nom de plume, Joseph O'Malley. And today I'm switching things up a little bit. I'm reading a story that's out of order. There are two more stories before it, but I thought I would read the title story, Great Escapes from Detroit, simply because I thought now that Marilynne Robinson's novel Jack is out, it might be a good time to talk about my experience with Marilynne Robinson, because a long, long time ago in a place far, far away called Iowa City, my sugar daddy, Joe O'Malley, was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and Marilynne Robinson was one of the mentors who was working there at that time. And this story, Great Escapes from Detroit, came up as the first story that Joe O'Malley presented in the workshop. And what I realized by the end of the semester is that the first story that goes up, Marilynne tends to eviscerate in her calm, quiet, measured way. And the second story, at least in my experience, was given sort of a mystical, magical reading in which she found all the good things in it. So this was the first story that went up in the workshop, and she said of it, this story, in her she's very calm, she's a lovely, lovely woman, and she said very calmly and very sweetly, this story fails as fiction. And I didn't really hear much else from that because the ringing in my ears for the next hour or two kept me slightly distracted. But I have since worked on the story, and I hope that it no longer fails as fiction, but I thought it would be an interesting little tidbit to include before I do read it. This, and it's also the title of the book, because Great Escapes from Detroit escape not just in a literal sense where one is able to escape the place where one grew up, but also the idea of escapes that one can make metaphorically. And for instance, even if you're in a prison, you can have a mental escape to someplace else. And if my life is about nothing, it's about escapism. So Great Escapes from Detroit, from Great Escapes from Detroit. Here's the very first opening part. This morning, when the phone rang, I'd hoped it was the brown-eyed man with fleshy earlobes I had met last night at the Giacometti exhibit in the Boston Museum of Fine Art. He called himself Chaz, short for Charles, but I overlooked that on account of the elegant curl of his upper lip over his straight teeth. I offered him my telephone number and an invitation to dinner. Instead of Chaz's eager acceptance of my dinner invitation on the other end of the telephone line, I heard my mother's bad news voice saying, "Peter." When everything is okay, she pronounces the T in my name as a soft, almost unspoken D. When there's trouble, I hear it in the sharp tick of her tongue against the roof of her mouth. She called to say that my cousin Alex died of a heroin overdose in New York City. When I was an adolescent boy, filled with wonder and anxiety, who couldn't accurately account for either, Alex was my best friend for a year. She came to live with us after her mother died. Her mother was my father's twin sister. The authorities said it was an accident, Mom said. She'd just gotten out of rehab again. Probably wasn't used to her old dose. She paused. She had my name and number listed at the rehab clinic as next of kin. She paused again. After all this time. Neither of us had seen nor heard from Alex in years. You okay? My mother asked. I guess. Poor thing. It must have been a hard way to live. But a relatively easy way to die, I said. My mother sighed in agreement. At the other end of the line, I heard water hitting the bottom of the porcelain sink in her basement studio. She was preparing a basin of water to soften the clay with which she makes decorative pottery to sell at arts and crafts fairs all around Michigan. "How's the strip?" she said. I'm a cartoonist with a syndicated strip called Stick Figure Man. My mother once told me in a fit of anger I incited that very little else about my life has made her so proud. "Fine," I said. "The strip is fine." "Good," she said. I'm often not as generous as I'd like when I talk to my mother on the telephone, and even when I want to say more, I have a hard time generating words to fill the 700 or 800 miles of space between us. "Her boyfriend has AIDS," she finally said. "Can you believe it? After all this time? Almost 1 million people died of it in 2017. I looked it up." The long pause that followed wasn't an attempt to create drama. She simply didn't know what to say next. I have a theory that my mother is always a little surprised that I'm a gay man in my 30s who still doesn't have either AIDS or a steady boyfriend. My guess is she's certain AIDS will be my end rather than the more likely one I imagine. The hereditary brain tumor, astrocytoma they call it, a star of derangement expanding under the skull, that killed my father, Alex's mother, and their father before them. "I'm negative, Mom," I said. "Good," she said. And just when I thought I had overstepped my bounds again and embarrassed her, she added, "Me too." So that's the beginning of Great Escapes from Detroit, a story that I call this my friend of my youth story because it kind of goes backward and forward in time and comes back to the present day at the end. But it was a bit of a miracle of an experience writing this because my goal at the time was to write two new stories every semester throughout the workshop, and I did accomplish that, even though some of them were hurried, and when they went up for workshop, some of them may have failed as fiction. It's a good way to make yourself keep to a schedule, to keep writing something new and to work on it over the years. So that's Great Escapes from Detroit. I'm leaving a link below for you to check it out. You can check it out at josepho'malley.com or at the link for Amazon. I think you can still get it on Amazon UK also. And if you'd like to read it and talk about it on your own channel, feel free to do that, or to tell your friends about it. If you hate it, tell me about that. Tell me why, though. You can't just say you hate it. You have to tell me why. And anything else that you'd like to tell me about it if you do indeed read it and decide to talk about it. Until we meet again, I'm Tootight Lautrec, wishing you the very best in the world and hoping that your world is filled with wonder that you can see because you're paying attention. Until we meet again. Mwah.